Hi everyone. As the next two assignments in this class are going to ask you to find relevant content area texts, I thought it would be a good idea to do a video to define what a content area text is and give you some examples so that you can have these in your mind as you start searching for these. So, what is a content area text? Well, my definition is simply any text you use to teach a concept in your content area or course. And your course could be anything from art, to shop, drama, business, world languages, anything that we teach in middle school and high school. The most obvious example of content area text is, of course, the textbook. But the problem with textbooks, as Tovani will point out in your next chapter, chapter 4, is that a lot of times textbooks are written on a level that is a higher reading level than the students are able to read. The other problem with textbooks, as we know, is that they're boring, usually, and written in sort of this dull academic chatter. So, two problems with textbooks. And a third is that sometimes they're either outdated, as in the sciences, because sometimes you run out of funding in a school for the new ones, or, as James Loewen has pointed out in Lies My Teacher Told Me, sometimes there's just flat out errors or misrepresentations. This book, if you're teaching social studies or history and you haven't read it, I urge you to. He compares the most popular, most widely used 20 American history textbooks and shows how there are glaring errors and omissions because they're trying to put so much material in there. So, problems with textbooks. Good content area texts, we use them, but they're not the only thing we've got in the bag. So, here's some other options for you and some examples that you can use. And Tovani is going to call these accessible texts in her next chapter. And by accessible texts, she means any text that is more engaging to students, that is more relevant, that is more sort of written with more voice, or surprise or intrigue or potential for debate. So texts that students can latch onto and engage with more easily. So here's some examples of things that would constitute content area texts that are not textbooks. One could be this book called Maus by Art Spiegelman, which I could use in an English language arts class to teach symbolism or to discuss World War II, but it's a graphic novel, and this could even be used in a history class. But notice that it's going to ask for a very different kind of reading because you're going to be interpreting images as well as text. You could use popular essays or science writing, as in the Best American Science and Nature Writing often has very good, very smart writing. And Sam Keene's Disappearing Spoon, which tells the story behind the periodic table while explaining how the elements interact and and who discovered them, the politics behind those. In a history class, rather than just reading the history textbook, you could actually look at the treaty, as in the Sioux Treaty here of 1868. You could look at the telegrams, you could look at diaries, you could look at all kinds of primary sources that may be more interesting to students than sort of the dull secondary summary that history textbooks tend to do. You can use magazines, you can use websites, and you can use texts like this one, The Math Book by Clifford Pickover, wherein he sort of tells you more about the formulas that we use all of the time. We could use a play, as in All My Sons by Arthur Miller. You could do this in an English class or a drama class. And you can use visual texts that don't actually have words, but that require interpretation. For instance, if you were looking at Picasso's Guernica and you were an art teacher, there is so much to tell students about reading this image, about how you interpret the symbols, about the background behind it. I think that in any discipline, we enjoy more when we understand how to interpret more. Here's our periodic table. No one ever taught me how to read this as a text or why it was arranged the way it was. And so for me, it was always just a dizzying series of letters. So teaching somebody just how to read this as a text would be important. This graphic here, I would need an earth science person to really explain this to me because I'm not sure entirely what I'm looking at. Same with a schematic. Until someone tells me how to read this, I'm going to have a little trouble figuring it out, and I'm going to have to make some guesses about that. So, the thing to remember about content area texts is that they help you teach concepts in your area. That's the most important thing. So you identify the concept you want to teach, and then you find texts that help you get at that the best way you can. They don't have to be a textbook, but they may be. They can be any genre. You can use a poem in a PE class if you want to be clever. They require reading strategies specific to the content area and genre. So depending on what you choose, you might have to do a little bit of teaching about how to read that kind of text. For instance, you read a play very differently than you read a recipe. So you might want to have a talk about how you approach those texts differently. And content area texts also have specialized vocabulary that you may have to teach up front. And they also often require a certain amount of background knowledge. So it's worth taking a look at those texts and asking yourself, what do students need to know to really engage or understand this text? And lastly, perhaps the most important thing is that really effective teachers use a variety of texts. And they not only use a variety of texts, but they show students how they read those texts and how they think about those texts as they're making sense of them, which is what I'm going to be asking you to do this week as you do your metacognitive narrations. I look forward to seeing your thinking.